afternoon and welcome to the Cleveland City Club Forum. I'm David Honan, a past president of the City Club, who had the privilege and honor of serving in that capacity in 1977. We are extremely proud and fortunate to have as our speaker today a pillar of the civil rights movement, a man who has been active in the struggle for human rights and economic justice for more than 50 years. He has had a long association with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was active in A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement and became the first field secretary of the Congress of Racial Equality. A Quaker, he was imprisoned in 1943 as a conscientious objector. He directed A. Philip Randolph's Committee Against Discrimination in the Armed Forces, which was instrumental in securing President Truman's order eliminating segregation in the armed forces. At Mr. Randolph's request, our speaker was granted temporary leave from his position as Executive Secretary of the War Resisters League to assist Dr. Martin Luther King in the early days of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. His extensive background in the theory, strategies, and tactics of nonviolent action were the foundation of his close association with Dr. King. He organized the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom in 1957, the National Youth Marches for Integrated Schools in 1958 and 1959, and was the Deputy Director and Chief Organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was this march that created the political climate for the passage of the major civil rights legislation of the 60s. In 1964, he helped found the A. Philip Randolph Institute, named for his mentor, the noted labor and civil rights activist. The Institute has over 180 local affiliates involved in voter registration drives and programs designed to strengthen relations between the black community and the labor movement. While working to promote democracy at home, he has also supported human rights struggles worldwide, including India's fight for independence from Great Britain, the fight to end colonial rule in Africa, and freedom for Soviet Jews. In 1975, he organized the Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. Recently, he started Project South Africa, which seeks to broaden American support of groups within South Africa that are attempting to bring about democracy through peaceful means. He's the recipient of numerous awards. 12 honorary degrees and a collection of his essays was published in 1971. He currently serves as co-chairman of the A. Philip Randolph Institute and president of the A. Philip Randolph Educational Fund, a sister organization with an international human rights focus. The title of his City Club Forum address is Civil Rights Today, From Race to Class, or the Declining Significance of Race. Please join me in welcoming to the City Club Forum the elder statesman of the civil rights movement, Mr. Bayard Rustin.
I must warn you that I am going to say some things which are not usually said. And that is my thesis, that so long as we concentrate merely on the elimination of racism in our effort to deal with the problems that black people face, we are on a reactionary course, because we will be obscuring the far more serious problems today than those which are created by either segregation or discrimination. To make this dramatically clear, I should like to say, first of all, that the title is The Declining Significance of Racism. Not that racism has been dealt with. Racism is very active in America. Not only against blacks, racism is active across the board. And the fact that black Muslims only yesterday could describe Jews the way in which they have been described, and to say that they are the enemy of black people, is not only a lie, It is a part of the incipient racism, the active racism, which is directed to blacks. But if we concentrate exclusively on racial questions, we automatically obscure the far more serious problems which are brutalizing black people. I should like, again, to put this in a nutshell. You have many poor blacks in Cleveland. If you were, by the movement of your hand, to change all of the poor blacks in Cleveland white tomorrow morning, so that segregation and discrimination against them on race were not possible, not a single major problem that they face would be addressed. Because the problems they face are the achievement of jobs, the achievement of housing, medical care, education, but even more important, psychological expectation, none of which are available to the poor blacks today. Now, to make this even more concrete, I should like to compare very quickly the 1960s, when we were having the great black upheaval, with the 80s. In the 1960s, segregation and discrimination were the chief problems we had to overcome, because we were interested in the 60s to obtain three things that all white people had and no blacks, except in a few places, had. The right to vote, all white people had it. The right to use public accommodations, all white people had them. The right largely to go to a school of your choice according to your economic ability, which all white people had. And therefore, in the 60s, we were right in describing the effort as a basic racial effort to be overcome. But today, when there are numerically more white people who need jobs and housing and medical care and education, to think you can have a black agenda in which this nation will do something about those four problems for blacks, when there are numerically more whites who are not having something done about them, is to misjudge the situation. Now I must be with care. To say that whites and blacks are equal would be a mistake. Blacks are far deeper in trouble on jobs, housing, medical care, and education. But since problems must be solved by political behavior and not by preaching, it does little good for me to tell anybody how much worse off blacks are in our society. Because that is not the basis on which things are achieved. They are achieved on the basis of a political unity that makes demands in the name of all who are in trouble. Do you really think a society which was prepared to have our Congress debate whether ketchup should be a vegetable? A society which is prepared to see elderly white people go with inadequate medical care, that is prepared to see white poor in horrible housing, that they are going to do something unique and exclusive for blacks? Even if they were inclined to do so, We could not maintain a multicultural society on the basis of such privilege. To give you an illustration of the depth of the problem, and I make no criticism of my black colleagues, all of whom are far as concerned as I to eliminate whatever problems America has. But I want to show you a mistake. To put the major economic emphasis of the black community on affirmative action indicates the problem, because affirmative action can only take place where jobs exist. But the major problem for the black community cannot be affirmative action. It is for the hundreds of thousands of economic black untouchables who may never work. And let me point out why they may never work, and to point out what is really new. When the Jews, the Irish, the Catholics, the Italians came to this country poor, very often ignorant, because it is seldom that people leave their country if they're well off. It is always the poor who want to go, unless there's a religious problem of some kind. Economic upward mobility for these people who were coming into our country was based on almost two single factors. One, expectation, and the second, work. And most of these refugees had nothing to work with except sheer muscle power. If anybody thinks any refugees came from Poland, whether they were Catholic, Irish, Jewish, and didn't have a hard time in our country, and that somehow only blacks are the people who had a hard time, this is a mistake. Many of those people lived in conditions which are as difficult then as blacks are living in now, and sometimes worse. But they were able to rise because this country wanted to buy their muscle power. Let me point out to you the technological revolution and the elements in it which are far more destructive to millions of black people than segregation and discrimination ever can be. One, that the production of goods today is such as to say to blacks who only yesterday were told, we want you to come into our society. We have passed the bills of the 60s, and now you may start up. Today they are told, you are nothing, we don't want you, we can't use you. Goods is being produced by automation, cybernation, and robots, a thing the poor refugees coming into this country never faced. Blacks will no longer, who are poor, again use muscle power as an upward mobility. Not only is it the production of goods, it is the distribution of goods. People, ship owners did not get in a corner and say, we hate blacks, and therefore we're going to create a technological proposition which will wipe blacks off the waterfront. They simply said, technologically, it's cheaper and better to ship goods in containers. At that point, blacks are off the waterfront with nowhere to go because they were there with their muscle power. Take the Jewish community in New York. I know that history very well because I was in it. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers, set up by David Dubinsky, a Jew. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers. All kinds of labor-intensive industries that the poor Jews could get an upward lift with. All of the labor-intensive industry now is going overseas. The clothes are not made here. Electronics are not made here. Try to buy a television in color made in the United States. Hats are not made here. Kitchen utensils are not made here. And I want to tell you that the inability of blacks to find work that they can do with the limited education they have and with nothing but muscle power to sell is far more devastating to the black community than racism ever will be. And I ask you a question. Why are the people who are so concerned with racism appear to have no concern whatever about these more basic problems? But it's even deeper. It has to do with the decline of American industry and our ability to compete in the world market. Owen Biber, I see, was here to speak to you. He must have told you that his workers are being devastated because we cannot produce cars as good and as cheap as the Japanese. The steel, the very steel workers on whom Martin Luther King sent me into Birmingham to get their automobiles to use during the strike so blacks could get to work. If I were to go to Birmingham now, I could not get automobiles from blacks because the bottom has fallen out of the steel industry and 50% of the blacks who formerly were working in steel are no longer able to find work. I could go on, ladies and gentlemen, with this, but I think by now you must have gotten the point. We are producing economic untouchables for a number of reasons. And because they are poor, they inevitably do what poor people do, misbehave in every conceivable way. If you will read George Bernard Shaw's introduction to Major Barbara, in which he comes to the conclusion that the greatest sin on earth is poverty, is because he believes that every other sin springs from it. So psychologically, my dear, when you say to people, black or white, you do not have work, you are automatically telling them that they are nobody, that you don't like them, that society doesn't like them, and that if they'll look at themselves, they don't even like themselves. If I say to you, who is Picasso? You will say painter. If I say, who is Beethoven? You will say musician. If I say to you, who is that chap sitting over there, standing over there? How are you doing? You will say, he is a cameraman. Describe for me in any social terms who is Mrs. Jones on welfare, and who is her son who cannot find a job. The only honest people in the society are people who say people on welfare are pigs, because that's what all of us have to believe. If they are not contributing to the production of goods and services in the society, we automatically cannot honestly respect them. Though I would hope we would never call people pigs. Do not misunderstand me. The effect of this leads to all of the evils that people are now talking about. If I say, Mrs. Jones, do you speak French? No. I will say, well, the French poets are amongst the greatest in the world. I urge you to speak French. I will give you for Christmas a French records from Berlitz. You will keep them 2 weeks and they will be in your closet. Expectation. If I say, Mrs. Jones, IBM has a job in Paris of $75,000 a year if you will learn to speak French in 3 months. She will learn it. all of the teenage pregnancy, the crime, the prison, the breaking of the black family, the dropout of schools, the dope, the preying of blacks on blacks in crime. I speak with young blacks at the New York Institute weekly when I'm in New York. And I said to a black the other day, your record shows that you have stolen 15 televisions from your black neighbors in the past few months. And he looks at me with a very cute smile on his face, and it made me think deeply. He said, Mr. Rustin, you don't expect that I can go down on Park Avenue and steal them from the white folks. I have to get away with them. All of these factors are not only in the picture, but they are, and I want you to listen to me carefully because I want to say this so I will not be under too much criticism, but I don't have enough time to be too careful about it. These psychological deficiencies, the decline of the black family added to it, are in fact creating a new and more dangerous racism in America. The old racism was based on prejudice. The old racism was based on ignorance. If you know anything about Pavlov's experiences, then the new racism is being based on sociological observation of things which are profoundly pathological. That is a far more serious possibility for racism. Now, my friends, I conclude by saying all of these technological developments which I have described were not created by black people. They were created by all of us, me included. All the people in America cannot be Luddites. We cannot fight automation. We cannot fight robots. We cannot fight all of these new developments. But we can recognize that if we bring into the stream of history things which make it impossible for people to work and thereby have dignity, we have a moral obligation to make an adjustment so that something can happen that restores the possibility of dignity to them. And that cannot be done by any one segment of the American society. It must be done by the poor themselves who try to better themselves. It must be done by every political, church, women's group, every group in this country which is a part of the democratic infrastructure. It must be done by the American business community, and it must be done by government. I am not one of those who say, let the government do it all. And I am certainly not one of those who say, the problem is really black people. Let them deal with all the problems of their pathology. Let me conclude by saying, ladies and gentlemen, although I was called here to talk about blacks in our society, the reality is there is nothing I have said about what is happening to poor blacks that is not but happening to poor whites. Anyone who is interested can send to my office, and I will leave the address here, for a new and amazing study that has just been completed on the white poor of South Philadelphia by 3 professors at Temple University. Every one of the problems of teenage pregnancy, dope, prison, single-family homes, dropouts from school, all of the things that we describe as black pathology are in this study about white poor. And therefore we get out of the dilemma we are in again by not making a racial analysis, but by making an analysis of the way in which people who are poor and have no hope behave. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rustin. Thank you very much, Mr. Rustin. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to Bayard Rustin with his review of today's status of civil rights. In just a moment, we'll turn to our traditional question period, but first, some announcements. As most of you know, the City Club is now observing its 75th anniversary as a famous citadel of free speech. And as a part of this recognition, a major fundraising effort is underway to ensure the continuance of the high quality of our forum programs. Under the direction of Stanley Adelstein, more than $200,000 has been raised to date, much of it in the form of $25,000 gifts, which will ensure an annual forum on a specific subject, such as the economy, national politics, and the environment, the justice system, and so forth. We are still seeking funds of this sort and would welcome the chance to talk with potential donors about this. Of course, smaller gifts are also welcome. Please call Alan Davis at 621-0082 for further information. Next week, our speaker will be the President of the County Board of Commissioners with his State of the County address, Timothy Hagan. He's titled his report, "The Future of Cuyahoga County, What Needs to Be Done." Then 2 weeks from today, the first Friday in August, our speaker will be economist and columnist Walter Williams of George Mason University, whose subject will be in the form of a question: how much does discrimination explain? Next week, Tim Hagan, and 2 weeks, Walter Williams. Make your reservations today for both of these important forums by calling 621-0082. Now for our questions for Bayard Rustin. We have 2 microphones, one at the front with Alan Davis and one in the rear with Bob Conrad. Raise your hands, please, to be recognized. May we have the first question?
Mr. Rustin, I am most impressed by your analysis of the economic underpinnings to poverty and discrimination within our society, and you have described in great detail that side of the coin. I would respectfully request your analysis of the other side of the coin, which namely is what types of proposals and programs should be developed both politically and economically to solve these problems which pervade our society.
One of the reasons I was at pains to avoid doing that is because I don't know how to do it. And what I did instead of pretending to be able to do something I couldn't was to say that when business, the democratic infrastructure, the poor themselves, and the government have a commitment to find alternatives, they will be found. Now, having expressed my ignorance, let me give you a few ideas that I know about. In certain northern European countries, it is illegal for any man to bring a technological development into his factory without first taking that development before a board made up of government, other businessmen, and trade unions. When together they have settled, how do we find work for these people in another field? How do we pay them while we are training them for that work? When that's all settled, they permit the machine to be brought in. As I said before, I am not a Luddite out to destroy machines. No technological development has ever appeared amongst mankind that hasn't been used. There is one I hope will never be, but it frightens me sometimes. And you know what I'm talking about. Bombs. Another interesting idea. While many blacks in this country consider Al Shanker a racist, I'm telling you what I know, because We went through the strike in '68 in New York, which was a terrible thing for race relations in New York. Al Shanker has probably made the greatest contribution to the elimination of the welfare system of anyone in the country, and no other city has followed suit. He created what he called paraprofessionals, taking hundreds of black and white women from the welfare rolls, with his union paying half the price of training them and forcing the city of New York to pay the other half. In a strike, he got this. These women started out doing what all poor women know how to do well if other things are well, and that is to love children. They took them to the toilet. They dealt with the disciplinary problems. They gave teachers more time to teach. The next year, he went back and got more money, and now from the federal government. And to make a long story short, the next year, these teachers were getting their high school equivalency. The next year, they were taking lessons in teaching children. The next year, they were going off to college. Women some of whom could not read at a fourth grade level. In New York City, we now have off the relief rolls and have had now for 8 years 5,000 teachers getting the same salary and benefits of all other teachers by way of the paraprofessional route. Look at all the things doctors do that are silly to waste their time. We could train any number of these kids who are getting arrested to take pulse, to be paraprofessionals, to keep records in doctors and dentists and others' office. I will go absolutely berserk, sir. Because if we're going to do anything right, we also have to have a few berserk ideas. I would like to see the poor used to make it possible for any woman in this room who cannot have a month away from her own children to have it, because she needs it. Why do we not get some of these young women who are having children like sausages because they have no hope? Put them in uniform. Give them a title which is noble, such as a child assistant, with other titles that go up. Get the federal government to train them. Get the states to train them, the women's clubs, the churches, the synagogues. We map out how they're to be trained. Then we bring in the police. You don't want people coming into your home that the police do not have a record of, and so we test them at that level. Now, like in Norway, if you want to go on a holiday and cannot afford it, you just pick up the telephone and say, my husband and I would like to leave. We would like some registered paraprofessional child care specialist to come. Now, you will say, that's a silly idea, and I'm sorry to go on at great length, but I want to relate it to American history. During the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt redesigned work. And the minute we were able to get on our going again, we lost sight of that. But poets were paid to write poetry on WPA. Richard Wright wrote his finest short stories on WPA. The only semblance of any real artistic expression in our public buildings were painted by out-of-work artists that we redefine painting buildings with murals work. And they did schools and hospitals and the like. My friend, the problem is not that Americans lack any imagination. It is that we lack the political will. An old man my age, over 75, don't let me kid you, is not the one who's going to come up with these new ideas. I did my thing. And even if I could, I shouldn't, because there are young people in this room who ought not to be robbed of the agony of solving their problems in the way I was not robbed of the agony of mine. I'm sorry to have been so long. I will be shorter next time.
Mr. Rustin, you probably know that Michael Harrington wrote The Other America while he was drawing unemployment compensation. But my question is, in my opinion, anything short of full employment is not acceptable. But we did have a Full Employment Act, the Humphrey-Hawkins.
46.
And it was passed in Congress. It's a law, but it's never been implemented. Mm-hmm. And after all these years, it's reasonable to assume that it never will be implemented. There is serious thought now that the only way that we're going to enjoy full employment is with a constitutional amendment. Would you care to comment on that?
If we have to wait for a constitutional amendment, we won't get it. I am positive. It is already, as you say, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill was not the first full employment bill. There was one in 1946 before theirs. You can have it, and for 200 years, the American Constitution was filled with lots of things. It took from 1787 to 1920, where all people were supposed to have equality for women to get the right to vote. It took to 1964 for blacks to get it. I am not one who believes that because it's in the Constitution it works. It works if it's in the Constitution and if there is a will amongst the American people to make it work. I'm sorry. I just don't think we have to be that extremist. I think you mentioned Michael Harrington. I want to give Mike a plug. I think that no major book ought to have done more to influence the American people in the direction I am now trying to talk than that book. It didn't. And so I'm going to drop Harrington a note and say it's now time for a second edition.
Sir, I recently worked in a high-tech high school in the Cleveland Public Schools. Each spring, the armed forces came in full force to recruit through high-level, sophisticated slideshows and talks for the armed forces. I was very distressed to find that many of the black young men and women, both, who could easily have gotten jobs because they were high-tech trained in our society, were joining the service and leaving the community. And I am wondering if the blacks are aware of the fact that many of the best and brightest of their young people are going off and learning how to kill and make war. I'm not opposed to the armed forces, but many of them could easily have succeeded at home and exhibited the leadership qualities that I saw evident in them.
I think your question is very important and helps in a way to help me further clarify my point. You say, and it is true, that many blacks go into the army for certain things that they could get without going in. Therefore, since we assume they're intelligent people and reasonable, we must ask why. Do they go one instead of another? It is not that blacks like killing. It is not that they like war. The United States Army has become the employer of first resort for the masses of black poor. And by virtue of their having a great number of people who are black in there making it, means that they lose this fear that they have that if I go into that corporation where everybody is telling me in Ebony magazine and Black Enterprise, you can only go so far and no further. but they look around their neighborhood and see all kinds of blacks, colonels, generals, and things in the army, they go in that direction. So let us have some sympathy for them, while at the same time, I agree with the implication of what you're saying, that we should also try to get as many as possible into other areas where they are needed.
Mr. Rustin, I think I hear you saying that work, jobs, is the most critical element in helping the underclass, black and white, come out of its present deplorable situation. I do not hear you, however, attacking or talking about what may be the most single serious problem that perpetuates what we have there. I refer you to the book Losing Ground by Charles Murray and the thesis that it is the enormous rise in governmental spending for welfare programs, transfer payments, ADC, food stamps, and the rest that have destroyed the incentives of those people living in poverty, where any job is going to be marginal. And that it is that tremendous increase in spending, now over $400 billion a year, way more than we spend on defense, that is the continuing cancer that perpetuates the problem. Would you like to respond?
Oh, I could not agree more. And that is the reason I went out of my way to talk about the Shanker experience. What Al did was to get government and the union to play a creative role, which in fact eliminated the government's having to spend a lot of money on welfare, and in fact brought money into the government's coffers. For those 5,500 women in New York are now taxpayers. If you proceed to invest X amount of dollars into what I have described as new careers for the poor, or what I would call the kind of thing we did in the WPA, and which is the kind of thing that I call paraprofessional activity, that is using X amount of funds. And if you'll note, I said the churches, the synagogues, the poor communities, as well as business and the government. I want everybody in it, because that's the way you build a political will, by getting everybody a stake in it. Now, if we were to do some of the things I'm proposing, and I don't think they're the most earth-shaking things, that ultimately would be far less money spent than the $10,000 to $15,000 we are spending annually to keep wrongdoers who can be redeemed with work locked up in prisons. That is not a modicum of the money to do the things I'm talking about that we are now spending to try to stop dope. No, I think it's a matter of choosing where you spend money. But I agree with you. The fundamental objective ought to be to use money in a way that you eliminate the problem. There was a man whose name was Maimonides. And Maimonides set up a hierarchy of how charity ought to be given by people who can afford to give it. And his highest priority is in keeping with what you and I are now saying. Give charity in that way, doing those things which eliminates the need for charity. No, I agree with you thoroughly.
Mr. Rustin, you mentioned the adverse flow of jobs in the United States to other countries, particularly in the steel industry and in clothing industry. And I'm just wondering if you have any answer to that problem in view of the fact that many overseas countries heavily subsidize these industries, and also their labor costs are so much less than they are in America. Do you feel this trend is going to continue? And if not, is there any possible way of ending it?
There are many things being done already. Unfortunately, I'm a part of one thing I'll tell you about. The AFL-CIO, including Mr. Bieber, who is here to talk to the club, spend millions of dollars annually organizing labor unions all over the world. Because I am not for brutalizing workers in Africa and Asia who have to live too. And for me to make the argument I want all intensive industry to stay here is ugly. They need it in Africa. They must have some. They have no hard currency. And the only thing that they can give us are cheap things with the labor they can produce. Well, you have to work both sides of the streets. I also go to many, many countries in the Caribbean, in Asia, India, Africa, under the auspices of the AFL-CIO, helping train trade unionists to build unions. Because the only way that they are ever going to increase their wages and stop the process of needing to prey on us is to make it impossible for the capitalists to say, oh my God, in Haiti, I can get workers for 15 cents an hour, which is what you can get them for. So he takes his plant there. When I was in Haiti, I just got back, I met with all the trade union leaders and said, I have a foundation. I want to come back in a few weeks. I want to set up some meetings with you and bring you some money to help trade. In other words, I don't want us to take an ugly protection America point of view. I want just the opposite. I want us to go to these places and to help do the kind of thing for labor that Ruther did, getting his head split in, organized, that A. Philip Randolph did here, in order to liberate people. My basic point is, ladies and gentlemen, whether we like it or not, there is no way to liberate ourselves without liberating others. And that is a very hard thing to build a political will around. I'm sorry, I'm taking much too much time.
Sir, full employment is obviously guaranteed in the Soviet Union. Why isn't it working more effectively there?
In the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Well, the problem with the Soviet, I have never for one moment proposed the elimination of capitalism. One of the reasons it's not working in the Soviet Union is because people simply will not function where there is not freedom. I am for capitalism. Second of all, you cannot build a creative society which is going to work if you deprive your middle class of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression in arts and music and drama, which the Soviet Union doesn't do. One of the reasons that Gorbachev is changing things, and when people say to me, is it genuine or isn't it genuine? It is most genuine. And the reason for it is, if he is going to catch up with the technology that we have in the West and Japan, if he is going to have anything to do in a world where the information revolution is going on, then he has got to free his middle class in order for them to participate in it, or they won't, and it won't work. No, I think I'm not talking about the elimination of capitalism. In fact, if I were very, very wealthy, I would be going around encouraging any great number of young blacks to do some of the kinds of things which the Koreans and others are doing with their vegetable stands, and what the Jews did when they were wheeling carts around the city of New York, and what Poles did in Chicago. But it's a different period, because in those days, people could save even what they eked out. No taxes, city, state, or federal, if you made a little money. All kinds of stair steps were provided that are not now provided. Yes, I'm sorry.
Mr. Rustin, in regard to political leadership, with a presidential campaign coming up in the near future, on the basis of what you've been talking about to us today, do you have a candidate that you're supporting at this point, or
I have no
what's your
candidate
approach?
at the present, but I have something better. Now, I want to talk very seriously to this audience. We are not going to get a candidate any better than Ronald Reagan if we proceed on the assumption that the problem is Ronald Reagan. The problem is not Ronald Reagan. How can the problem be Ronald Reagan when no president in our history was elected with such an overwhelming majority as he was? Whatever there is in him that reflects into something you don't like, it is because that mandate was there before he went into the White House, or he wouldn't be there. And therefore, just like concentrating on racism obscures major problems, so does concentrating on Reagan obscure the fact that if you look at what has happened, there is not a single thing that he has done that's called destructive, if it had to do with money, that did not begin in the House of Representatives where the Democrats were in majority. How do you account for that? No, we have to lose our emotionalism and scapegoatism and the devil theory of history. The devil theory of history will inevitably lead you down the wrong road. It's like making Hitler responsible for anti-Semitism, when anti-Semitism in Poland and Germany and Eastern Europe had gone on for generations. In Russia, just look at the word beyond the pale and where it originated to know that. I am sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm very upset. And the reason I am is that it is likely that if the American people are simply going to be told the vote they made the last time is wrong, without coming through with some very new ideas that do not make them feel guilty for having voted for somebody, I don't know what's going to happen. And if you will note, except for two Democrats who have no possibility of being elected, Jesse Jackson being one of them, most of the others are not saying very much.
Mr. Rustin, earlier you commented on one aspect of Mr. Murray's book, and I'm sure you're familiar with the writings of Thomas Sowell.
Yes.
It appears to me that they properly address the problems of welfare, but it also appears to me that they suggest that the solution is to abandon welfare and return to something like the law of the jungle, a battle for survival, and so on. Is my interpretation correct, and how do you feel about it?
Let me say that many black people and many white liberals are very much against Thomas Sowell and 5 or 6 other blacks now who are making the kind of analysis some of them are making. I happen to believe that Mr. Sowell's making the analysis he does is useful, because it forces us to face some questions we did not face before. Illustration. A great deal of the war on poverty had nothing to do with poverty. It had to do with putting money into the coffers of the black middle class to keep them quiet. And some of these boys are pointing that out. Where I disagree with that school of thinking is not in their analysis, but in the conclusions they come to, which I think are quite wrong. Which is somehow or other you can let this little group, that little group, or nobody do it, or trickle down. I'm far removed from his analysis, and I say, unless business, the churches, the synagogues, the women's clubs, everybody, the lawyers are going to get into this act, we're not going to solve it. What we will do is further destroy our society, because the only alternative to what I am proposing is special privilege. And special privilege will not work. I'll give you an illustration, and I'm sorry to use the last minutes for this, but it's important. In New York City, blacks, Hispanics, and the mayor, who happens to be Jewish, sat down and drew up a test because they needed 75 police lieutenants. The blacks, Hispanics, and whites all took the test. The blacks and the Hispanics failed the test because they did not get the kind of help everybody knew they needed to pass it. Thereby, the Hispanic and the black community came out and went into court on the basis that although they had made up the test, it could not be discriminatory, but the results were. Now, what the hell does that mean? Either we go down the road I am trying to hint at, or we're going to end up going down the road, only one that is left, special privilege. And that will tear this society apart. I am for special privilege, but not on the basis of race, ethnicity, or religion. I am for special privilege where you say, we set up an economic standard, and anybody whose family makes less than X can get the following help. And therefore, that help's going to be the Catholics, the Protestants, the Jews, and everybody else, because we all have such families. But special privilege on any other basis is destructive to the multicultural society. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Rustin, thank you. Thank you, too, ladies and gentlemen. The City Club Forum is adjourned.